I'm Iris Tao in for Steve Lance. President Trump now suggesting that Ukraine should fight to take back all land from Russia. And the president also criticizing the UN's funding of uncontrolled migration. We now go live to NTD's Washington correspondent Mari Otsu at the White House. Mari, good evening. What's President Trump now saying today about Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, good evening, Iris. A big posture change today from President Trump on the Russia-Ukraine war. President Trump is now saying that he thinks that Ukraine can fight and win back all of the land that it lost to Russia. President Trump says that he's changing his mind after coming to fully understand the economic and military situation of both Russia and Ukraine. He says that Russia and Putin are in, quote, big economic trouble and that it's thus time for Ukraine to act now. And this is a big shift from President Trump's earlier position when he called on Kyiv to make land concessions to end the war. And this shift is coming just a couple of hours after President Trump sat down in a bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the 80th UN Assembly today. Here's President Trump in another bilateral meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron talking about his stance change. Look.
The other side can fight too. And they've proven that. Maybe it could be that Russia's a paper tiger. So it's a very sad situation. But most of you have seen the recent statement I put out a little while ago. And I'm glad you got it. But I feel that way. I really do feel that way. Let them get their land back.
And while the president is changing his posture on Ukraine getting its land back, he's remained consistent in urging Europe, in particular NATO, to financially support Ukraine. President Trump is also criticizing China for funding Russia's war machine. I'm going to play that clip next. And then one of President Zelensky, after today's meetings, saying this about China. Watch.
China and India are the primary funders of the ongoing war by continuing to purchase Russian oil. But inexcusably, even NATO countries have not cut off much Russian energy and Russian energy products, which, as you know, I found out about 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't happy. Think of it. They're funding the war against themselves.
United States, President Trump. And I think that President Trump can change the attitude of Xi Jinping to this war. Because China, I mean, we don't feel that China wants to finish this war.
President Trump says that the U.S. is prepared to impose very high tariffs to end the war, but for those tariffs to be effective, European nations need to join the U.S. and impose the same measures. Iris?
Well, secondary tariffs on potentially China would be definitely an effective way to pressure both China and Russia. Meanwhile, Mari, President Trump today also criticized the UN as a body. What does the president say today about specifically immigration and the role that UN played in it?
Sure, Iris. Yes, today the president was very critical of the UN funding what he calls an assault on Western countries and their borders. President Trump says that in 2024, the UN budgeted $372 million in assistance to support migrants journeying to the U.S. And the president warns that the same thing is happening in Europe right now. Take a look.
Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. In the United States, we reject the idea that mass numbers of people from foreign lands can be permitted to travel halfway around the world, trample our borders, violate our sovereignty, cause unmitigated crime, and deplete our social safety net. I hope that all countries who find inspiration in our example will join us in renewing our commitment and values.
Meanwhile, on the Israel-Hamas war, President Trump again demands that all of the hostages get released immediately, both living and dead. He also criticizes the many European nations who have been recognizing Palestinian statehood, saying that doing so only rewards Hamas for the October 7 attacks. Iris, back to you.
Thank you for the update, Mari. And as the UN General Assembly takes place today in New York City, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is criticizing the UN and saying that it did not do much in pushing for peace in both Gaza as well as in Ukraine. Here's the next story. Watch.
Why do we still have a UN? It has tremendous potential. The UN is an organization that has the potential to do some great things around the world, but it's not doing it.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the United Nations is not playing the role that it should in working toward peace in countries that are at war.
If you look at Russia and Ukraine, you have a war going on there. It's the president that's been carrying the burden of trying to bring it to an end. The UN is playing no role. If you look at what's happening in Gaza with Hamas and everything that's happened there with Israel taking them on, what role is the UN playing? None.
Rubio added that President Trump has been putting in more work toward ending wars than anyone else in the world. Over the past few months, Trump has brokered peace deals between Azerbaijan and Armenia, ending a war between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, stopping the fighting between Thailand and Cambodia, as well as India and Pakistan. Regarding the war in Gaza, Secretary Rubio says the only way forward is the elimination of the Hamas terrorist group.
You can't have peace as long as Hamas exists.
Rubio says that several U.S. allies recognizing a Palestinian state is irrelevant, and it rewards Hamas and its October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. He says these countries are only doing this because of internal pressure from foreigners who have migrated into their countries and are now protesting. With the Russia-Ukraine war, it's been more than a month since President Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Since then, the war hasn't let up, with Russian drones crossing into NATO airspace. The Trump administration has imposed sanctions on India for buying Russian oil, and several countries in Europe are still buying Russian oil, which Rubio says is fueling the war, adding that the U.S. may impose more sanctions targeting Russia.
The president's already repeatedly expressed his deep disappointment at the direction that Putin is taking this, even after Alaska. And at some point, he may have to decide to impose new sanctions. But I think it's important for Europe to impose sanctions, too.
And as these conflicts continue, the U.S. is urging the United Nations to step up in its efforts to join the U.S. in its work to bring about peace to these regions. Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
And President Trump saying today at the UN that recognizing Palestine as a state would reward Hamas for its October 7th terrorist attack. Meanwhile, Israeli forces report killing more terrorists in Gaza City, one of Hamas' final strongholds. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
Multiple Western countries at the United Nations, including the UK and Canada, recently recognized Palestine as a state. However, President Trump, speaking at the UN on Tuesday, said this recognition rewards the Hamas terrorist group.
The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities, including October 7th. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands, those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now.
And Trump added this about the remaining hostages still held in the Gaza Strip.
I always said the last 20 are going to be the hardest, and that's exactly what happened. We have to get them back now. We don't want to get back 2, and then another 2, and then 1, and then 3. Have this process. No, we want them all back.
Meanwhile, the French ambassador to the UN recently said that the roadmap to a Palestinian state would include the disarmament of Hamas, without explaining how Hamas would give up its weapons. Israel's ambassador to the UN said this on Tuesday.
You know, I listened very carefully to the speeches today. Many leaders said we expect Hamas not to be part of the equation in the future. But no one actually explained how it's going to be accomplished, because they know it's only on our shoulders. That's the duty to make sure Hamas will be out of the game. So we will continue, we will finish the job, and we will create a better opportunity not only for Israelis, but also for the Palestinians in Gaza.
This comes as Israeli troops reported killing more terrorists in Gaza City, one of Hamas's final strongholds. On Monday, they released this video of a terrorist who was part of a cell that had just attacked Israeli troops, seriously injuring one officer. The terrorist then hid in the rubble just before Israel launched an airstrike and killed him. Israel has also been launching airstrikes in Gaza City, which is located in the northern Gaza Strip. A local resident shared his thoughts.
We are heading into the unknown. We don't know where we're going. I swear, we don't know where we are going. Our tent was given to people who didn't have any homes. We told them, take this tent and live in it. Where should we go now?
And on the same day, residents were seen with their belongings fleeing from the northern Gaza Strip to the southern part of the territory. Jason Perry, NTD News.
And joining us now to unpack the geopolitical implications of the UN General Assembly is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer. Hal, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Iris.
So first, the UN General Assembly kicking off today in New York City with much of the focus on wars in Ukraine and Gaza. And President Trump renews his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, but also criticizes several European nations for recognizing a Palestinian state. First, what do you make of the divide between the U.S. and Europe here on this issue?
Well, Iris, there is a big divide. You have Australia, the UK, Canada, Portugal, all saying prior to the UN General Assembly that they recognize a Palestinian state. France, of course, saying that they recognize a Palestinian state. France and Saudi Arabia have been working very closely on this for some time. And the U.S. is saying, no, let's get a peace agreement into place. Let's get the hostages, out of there, released, get a peace agreement in place. Then we'll work on, whether it is a two-state solution or whatever it is. Germany has kind of taken the same stance. They've said, look, let's get a peace agreement in place, then work on this. There are two views out there, though. One view is that they're rewarding Hamas, which there is some truth to. Would this be on the table if there wasn't for the October 7th attacks and the war that's taken place? Then the other side, though, is it's kind of taken power away from Hamas because all of those things say, hey, release the hostages. Hamas is not part of the governance solution. They're gone. But as the Israeli ambassador to the UN pointed out, everybody says this stuff, but there's no plan in place to get Hamas out of there.
Well, certainly a concerning situation still in Gaza. And now let's turn to the Russia-Ukraine war. President Trump today said on Truth Social that, quote, Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble and that this is the time for Ukraine to act. He also said during a meeting today with Zelensky that NATO should strike down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace. What do you make of the president's tone today towards Russia?
Iris, this was such a shift from where we were a month ago. You remember the red carpet in Alaska with Putin and shaking hands and the cordial discussion, the hopes for peace. And then the next Monday after that, you had 7 major European leaders meeting at the White House trying to work for a peace agreement. And of course, it has gone nowhere. It has died. However, I was very heartened to hear President Trump finally say something which many have been saying for some time. The Russian economy is in really bad shape. And it looks to get in far worse shape. There are systemic, fundamental problems with the economy that Putin can't fix. So I was really glad to hear that. Also, basically saying, look, kind of putting the bar up there, saying, Ukraine could take back all of its sovereign territory, and with U.S. and European help. That's something we haven't heard with this administration. That's a big shift. And then, of course, I have to tell you that the one that really was very forceful, MiG-31s, 3 MiG-31s flew over Estonian territory. We've had drones flying in from Russia into Poland and Romania. They've been pushing the envelope, and the president has finally said, "Hey, look, they do that, we can shoot them down." That is a very forceful statement, and I think that was heard very much in Moscow.
Well, definitely very major statements made today and a big shift, like you said, when it comes to Ukraine's territory. Meanwhile, speaking to European nations today, President Trump threatened to impose a, quote, very strong round of powerful tariffs on Russia. But he also criticized Europe for continuously buying Russian oil. Take a listen.
Europe has to step it up. They can't be doing what they're doing. They're buying oil and gas from Russia while they're fighting Russia. It's embarrassing to them, and it was very embarrassing to them when I found out about it, I can tell you that. But they have to immediately cease all energy purchases from Russia. Otherwise, we're all wasting a lot of time.
How much impact do you think sanctions could have on Russia's war efforts, including, for example, secondary sanctions? And how important is it for European allies to stop buying Russian energy products?
Well, I'll tell you, on the secondary tariffs, the secondary sanctions, if you will, we've already kind of done that with India with the 50% sanctions. We haven't done to China yet. I think there's a couple, three reasons on that. Number one is we're in the middle of major trade negotiations with China. The TikTok deal just looks like it's maybe getting figured out this week. So there's a lot of other things going on. And also the other thing is we import so much from China that if we were to put 100% or 500% tariffs, that inevitably would cause price increases on the store shelves. That would have an inflationary effect, and that would definitely stop the Fed from doing any further cuts. And the president definitely wants the Fed to further cut the prime. So there are some reasons why not. But the other thing he also points out, which is very true, Europe, 3.5 years into this, still importing a tremendous amount of natural gas, still importing quite a bit of oil. And there are alternative sources for oil. Natural gas, a little more difficult, but there is liquefied natural gas that they can get in there. It could take up a lot of that slack. And he's calling them out on it, and very strongly, and basically making Europe a big stakeholder in these big tariff or sanctions moves if we all go together.
And like you pointed out, while there are concerns about imposing sanctions on China, President Trump as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio both have pointed out that China is actually playing a major role in funding Russia's war machine. Actually, Zelensky tonight saying that China is a big part of it as well. And meanwhile, on China here, Secretary of State Marco Rubio also went on Fox this morning talking about what the United Nations as a body has become. Let's roll that clip.
The U.S. is asking for the UN to step up and play a very important role. We have a lot of support, but it looks like China might stand in the way of this effort to bring that about. The UN will play no role if they do that.
How do you see China's influence on the UN? Is that working in contrary to U.S. interests?
Well, it has been, and it has been consistently, and that's part of our frustration with the United Nations as an organization. The United States hosts the UN headquarters. It's in New York City. And China is a permanent member of the United Nations, as is Russia. And what that means, of the Security Council, they're permanent members, which means they have veto authority. We have veto authority as well, as does the United Kingdom and France. And so what this means is that that China has tremendous influence with a lot of different countries. It's massive Belt and Road Initiative, which, by the way, is also a big liability for China because they loaned all that money out, and a lot of those loans may be bad loans. They may never get that money back. It could be $1 trillion question for the economy. And then the other issue is the influence that they're trying to use in there. Interestingly, though, as the U.S. has kind of pulled back in terms of its engagement with the UN, China hasn't stepped up like some people predicted they will. And I think that's because there are fundamental weaknesses in the Chinese economy. I think there's real problems with the yuan, real problems with, of course, this real estate thing, which has not stopped with property across the board. And then, of course, that $1 trillion debt bomb from Belt and Road. It wouldn't take much to see a big shift. And I think that's one of the reasons China is kind of holding back a little bit. Although, as you mentioned, they are supporting Russia, and they're doing a lot of support of Russia.
And to your point, given China's troublesome economy, potential tariffs might actually be very powerful as well. Thank you so much for your insights, retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal. Appreciate you. Thank you.